So next up, we're really lucky to have Erik van Winkle, who's a core member of the DeSci Labs team focused on operations and community. His background is in applied organizational design, product development, and operations. Erik was also one of the core members of Constitution DAO, so tons of experience building distributed communities kind of aimed towards public goods. The title of his talk is Converting Intellectual Capital to Social Capital, Rebuilding Communication Pathways Between Scientists and the General Public. So Erik, great to have you. Good to see you again.
Hey, Patrick, it's good to see you too. This has been an amazing conference to get to listen to. I particularly love everything that Eugene and Shadi just presented on, and a little sad that I'm coming right after them, but that's okay. Really excited to talk to people about reconnecting the general public and science. So for reference, this is a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about. I'm not a PhD myself, always wanted to be one, but pretty quickly figured out in college that was possibly going to spend more time chasing grant money than I was actually doing research, and was recommended by a couple friends and family not to go for it. So excited to have found DeSci and this incredible group of people to kind of continue working through science and continue trying to bring it to the forefront of humanity and anything that anyone talks about. So what I want to talk about today is something that's top of my mind on a regular basis. I grew up in the southeastern United States, which for those of y'all who don't know is typically a hotbed for misinformation. And it's the kind of thing that tears people, friendships, families apart. There are a lot of problems that come out of this, and it's something that I've been wanting to solve for a very long time. So the moment that I saw the work that DeSci Labs was doing and the larger DeSci space, I didn't really have a choice but to jump in. So what I'm going to be talking about today is converting intellectual to social capital, and how we can use this DeSci movement to try and rebuild some of the communication pathways between scientists and the general public. So it's one thing to rebuild the pathways between science enthusiasts and scientists, but as we saw during the COVID pandemic, we actually do need to rebuild pathways between the entirety of the general public, because a lot of the problems that we face in today's society are wildly complex and require extensive coordination to have any kind of an impact. So I think that DeSci has a lot of potential to move forward with that and to make a meaningful difference in this space. So the first thing that I want to talk about is different kinds of capital that exist in the world. And what you're seeing right now is just one framework. There are quite a few out there, but I think it does a good job of explaining where I want to go with this. So you can almost think of these different forms of capital as a type of language, where the base capital of the world is undoubtedly financial capital. How much money can this make? How much is that going to increase my quality of life? That's going to determine whether or not I do something. But as Eugene kind of mentioned earlier in this call, he doesn't value financial capital nearly as highly as he values other forms. Intellectual was the one that he put out there first and foremost. And I think it's important to realize that all these forms of capital have different allocation and valuation preferences for different groups. And that if you think of them as a language, if you're someone who values intellectual capital and you're trying to speak to someone who values social capital, you are quite literally speaking a different language. It's something where it's not that you're not saying the right words, it's that there's no possible way that it can come across. So as we start to think about how to rebuild the connections and trust with the general public, we need to be aware of this difference in language, of this difference in culture, and of this difference in capital allocation and valuation preferences. So academia tends to value intellectual capital. As someone who's coming into the space, just seeing it for the first time, the, I guess, importance of citations has kind of hit me in the face like no other. Your ability to come up with an innovation determines your career. That being said, the general public, while they do value intellectual capital, their base capital is going to be much, much closer to social, You could also make an argument for cultural capital, but I personally believe that it's social. And one thing that we kind of see is that there's no efficient conversion between these two. There's no direct translation between intellectual capital and social capital. And that leads to a lot of problems because what one group values heavily, the other doesn't necessarily value quite as heavily. That leads to a lot of miscommunications and a breakdown in these communication pathways that leads to eventual mistrust and people not taking the COVID vaccines. One of the things that I see as being wildly powerful in the decentralized science movement is the ability to reconnect intellectual and social capital. And I'll go through a little bit more of how to do this, how I think we can do this in the near future. But I want to say that the current method of conversion goes through financial capital. And it can in some ways be thought of as VC. It can be thought of as manufacturing and invention. Yes, I may not understand quantum mechanics, but my iPhone works and that's pretty cool. So having this financial capital as the intermediary gives losses in information as it travels through the larger system. So DeSci being able to bridge these two groups has a lot of power. Moving on from that, I think that DeSci has the ability to convert between intellectual and social capital. And as I was thinking about it over the past few weeks, kind of breaks down into three distinct phases. And it's similar to what Shadi was just talking about in primitives. And I think Patrick and Eugene even touched on it in talks earlier today as well. So backbone infrastructure would be the very foundation of intellectual capital. Things like DeSci nodes, where we are building the actual Web3 native unit of knowledge that a piece of information can live in. Something like Holonym from OpSci, which can form the reputation and kind of identity and access management system. All of these different pieces of infrastructure can form the basis of intellectual. But in the same way that a scientist may not necessarily be able to read every single paper in their field, a member of the general public is not going to be able to read every single paper in science. It's just not going to happen. So it's incredible to have this base currency, this backbone infrastructure like DeSci nodes, but it's important to realize that there are other steps in converting. The next step above that, as I see it, would be social scientific networks. It would be groups of people, whether they are PhDs, whether they are enthusiasts, or whether they're just regular Joes, coming together in pursuit of a better world. And shout out to ResearchHub for, first off, putting on this conference, but second, for building one of the most robust and powerful scientific social networks in the DeSci space today. It was also really exciting to see Eugene's talk on a lot of the work that they're doing on Web3 specific scientific social networks. Then finally, experiential value, public outreach, digital museums. Some of these experiential concepts are what really bring people into science. And I'll go through it in a later slide, but you need to be able to get your hands in there. You need to be able to experience it for yourself. And Web3 and the metaverse have the potential to enable that. So next slide would be the backbone infrastructure. We need to think about how we remake intellectual capital in the digital world. Backbone infrastructure is kind of the basis for this. So we need a Web3 native unit of knowledge. And Chris is going to be presenting on DeSci nodes, I think 2 or 3 talks from now. So I won't go too far into that because I don't want to steal his thunder here. But we need to think about how replication and quality science are being built into the very foundation of intellectual capital. We need to think about how we're making this open, how we're making it verifiable, how we're distributing ownership among people, how we're bringing funding in. This larger scientific system and the backbone infrastructure behind it forms the basis for intellectual capital. But as I said earlier, no one's going to go in and read every single paper. Very few people have time. So the next point is scientific social networks that can facilitate the conversion between intellectual and social capital. It's open communities of people who are passionate about a subject. It may be exclusively PhDs, maybe exclusively average Joes, but every single Joes and Jades, excuse me, I keep saying that. Every single time that someone comes into one of these networks, they're working to push forward. Now, these networks can be used for a variety of different purposes. They can do curation and validation at scale. They can provide services to the larger scientific community that help advance human knowledge. They can do things like educational content creation. I will say, I think we have one of the best communication arms that we have ever had for science in the history of time. It's a little nerdy, but I tend to fall asleep watching YouTube videos from this one guy named Niall Red, who makes the most incredible chemical reactions and just has a great way of explaining how things are done. Now, I would not call myself an expert on organic chemistry, but it's enough to get me interested. And having some of those networks to actually facilitate that information is incredibly powerful. But finally, we need to work towards experiential value. And that's one thing that I'm hoping that DeSci can start thinking about in the near future. So growing up, I would learn about science through parents and teachers who would give me hands-on examples. You build the balsa wood bridge, you make the volcano out of baking soda and vinegar. You go on a walk with a family member and they quiz you on algebra. It's actually being hands-on and in the middle of science. Now, one thing that the scientific social networks can facilitate is people being in there, but there are many, many, many more ways that we can do this. One of the ways that I think is the most powerful is utilizing the metaverse properly. This concept of a digital metaverse that facilitates science and education has been around for quite some time. It's been a common theme in sci-fi over the years, but I think that DeSci can actually build that. I think that we can make a stunning digital vista where knowledge can be, where we're building experiences around the very foundation of knowledge, around the Web3 native unit of it, where we're recombining science and art into something beautiful that people can come in and interact with, and where we're enabling education through digital mediums of future generations. So I was out at dinner with family the other day, and two little nieces were both playing on their iPad. I go up to them, Courtney, Savannah, well, what are you playing? What are you doing? Oh, we're playing Minecraft. It's like, wait, they have that on iPads? Oh, that's awesome, cool. Every single, or a large portion of the next generation of scientists will be web native. That's something that I think everyone in this conference knows, and that we can use to our advantage. Through the power of VR and AR, we can create incredible worlds that they can go explore, the next generation of Minecraft. We can take some of these base units of knowledge and use them to build out places for interaction, for questions, and for learning. We can take some of the decentralized education movement that's just now starting to pop up. If any of y'all haven't heard of it, it's a cool one. And build temples to learning in this larger digital world. To me, I think that this experiential digital science is where we really reconnect with the general public, is how we work to solve some of the larger societal issues that we see popping up on a daily basis. I know we're running a little bit behind on time, so I'm going to do my best to kind of speed things up for y'all. We'll quickly go to Q&A, if that's okay with you, Ricardo. Do want to close out by saying thank you to Patrick and Ricardo and the entire ResearchHub team for putting on this conference. If you'd like to join the conversation, here is a QR code that links to our Discord, and we'd love to have you there.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. That was really cool, and excited for Chris's presentation later on DeSci nodes. So just in the interest of time, we just have one question, and then we'll move on to the Women in Web3 talk next. But Joanna in the audience asks if you foresee a marketplace for social capital eventually.
I foresee a marketplace for social capital. So I was actually debating with a friend about this. not too long ago out in Austin. I think anywhere that we can enable markets in Web3, we're probably going to. So I would be surprised if there isn't one that already exists today. That being said, an efficient market for social capital would be a difficult but interesting thing to try and enable. I think Lens protocol kind of does this to an extent, as you would have to pay someone to follow them and to learn about their tweets, but there's so many other forms of social capital. It's not just the communication pathways, it's trust, it's networks, there's a lot that goes into it. I would be interested to see, and I would be shocked if things along those lines don't start popping up in the not too distant future.